Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulullah. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. May peace be upon you. This is Edward Ahmed Mitchell, your host for today's segment of Muslim Network TV. Thank you so much for joining us. We truly appreciate it. Today, we have a very special guest and a very special discussion. You all have been watching every day for the past 10 months the horrific war crimes unfolding in Gaza, the killing of innocent people, the starvation, the slaughter, much of it being done, sadly, with the support of the United States government. But we've seen many members of our government speak out against what's happening. Civil servants, political appointees, including some who have stepped down from their positions so they can speak freely about what's happening and encourage our government to do better. Today, we're going to hear from one of those leaders within our government who stepped down, and we're going to get to ask him some questions about why he did that and where he thinks U.S. policy will be going in the future. Let me first tell you a bit about him. Mr. Josh Paul resigned from the State Department in October 2023. He resigned due to his disagreement with the Biden administration's decision to rush lethal military assistance to the Israeli government in the context of its war on Gaza. He had previously spent over 11 years working as a director in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, which is responsible for U.S. defense diplomacy, security assistance, and arms transfers. Mr. Paul previously worked on security sector reform in both Iraq and the West Bank, with additional roles in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, U.S. Army staff, and as a military legislative assistant for a member of the U.S. House Armed Services Committee. Mr. Paul grew up between London and New York, and he holds master's degrees from the Universities of Georgetown and St. Andrews, Scotland. He is currently a non-resident fellow at the organization Democracy for the Arab World Now, DAWN, and a recipient of the 2023 Callaway Award for Civic Courage. We're very happy to welcome on Mr. Josh Paul. Let's bring him in. Hello, Mr.
Hello,
Paul.
thank you very much for having me.
Yes, of course. We're very happy to have you. How are you doing?
I think all things considered, I'm doing all right, thank you, and I hope the same is true for you and all of your audience.
Absolutely. Despite the difficult circumstances, we're happy that we can have this conversation and try to make some positive change through our voices. So, Mr. Paul, first, very basic question. Tell me a bit about the work that you did for the State Department before you resigned. Just give us an understanding of what your responsibilities were, what your duties were.
Sure. So I worked in something called the Bureau of Political Military Affairs, as you mentioned, which is the part of the US government that is responsible, amongst other things, for the vast majority of our arms transfers, export licenses of defense technology, government-to-government arms transfers, and that is a global portfolio. The United States is, for better or worse, and frequently worse, by far the world's leading exporter of arms. We have 41% of the market. And so under US law, all major arms sales require notification to Congress. There is a lengthy process in place of congressional review of major arms sales. And so my job in particular was to provide political advice to the administration on how to proceed with those and to work with Congress to advance those transfers and, to obtain, for example, that taxpayer funding that enables our security assistance to many countries around the world.
Understood. And you've been doing that job for how long?
A bit over 11 years.
11 years, wow. Now let's jump to October 2023. You have the October 7th attack. You have the beginning of Israel's bombing campaign in Gaza. What was happening behind the scenes? What was happening behind the scenes of the State Department that caused you such concern during this time period?
Well, I had concerns about the U.S. relationship with Israel in terms of our arms transfers for many years, particularly having served in the West Bank in 2008 to 2009 and seen what was happening on the ground there in terms of the expansion of settlements, the daily humiliation of Palestinians, and the complete impunity with which the Israeli defense and security forces operate in that context. I was also, in the West Bank in that period, which was during one of the initial conflicts between Hamas and Israel, in which well over 1,000 Palestinian civilians were killed. That was what the Israelis called Operation Cast Lead in 2008, 2009. So I'd been raising concerns, and to be clear, raising concerns about our relationships with another number of other countries who have, poor human rights track records for many years. What changed for me in October of last year was it very quickly became clear that the scale and scope of Israel's operations in Gaza, for lack of a better term, were well beyond anything that we had seen up to that point. There had been previous clashes, but, what Israel was doing from day one was, massive bombardment and massive civilian harm. The other part of the problem was that in all of the previous discussions I'd been in, on human rights and arms transfers, there had been some space to have a discussion, to have a policy discussion or policy disagreements even within government, and to have some sort of an impact that would mitigate some of the worst outcomes. In this circumstance, the directions were very clear coming from the very top of the US government, from the top of the State Department, and from the White House, that there would be no discussion, that we would be moving forward with as whatever Israel requested, as quickly as Israel requested it, no questions asked. And so faced with, in my role, I was part of the arms transfer approval process. So I was required to sign off on these. So faced with that sort of complicity, faced with the scale and the scope of the disaster that was unfolding, and faced with the inability to do anything about it from within government, I felt that the only path to me was to raise these issues outside of government, where at least they could be heard by the American people.
Now, Mr. Paul, one of the things that puzzled me is that very early on, the Israeli government, several officials made it clear that they were planning to commit war crimes. The Israeli defense minister said there are no innocent civilians in Gaza. We're going to be cutting off water, fuel, electricity because we're fighting human animals, and we're going to act accordingly. The Israeli president is the one who said that it's a myth there are civilians in Gaza. Prime Minister Netanyahu made that analogy to the biblical story of Amalek wiping out every man, woman, infant, and ox in a place that had attacked the kingdom of Israel. Were government officials aware of this sort of rhetoric? Was there any concern that they were going to act on these threats?
So certainly government officials were aware of this rhetoric, right? I mean, they all read the same newspapers that all of us do. I do think that there were a couple of things that were happening. First of all, I think what Israel experienced in those first few days after October 7th was very much an emotional reaction. I think what the United States government also experienced to a great extent was an emotional reaction. I think that there was a sort of echoing of that same emotional response, which is unfortunate, right? In particular for the US government, because it is not our job to react to events around the world with emotion. That is not a recipe for success. It is our responsibility to react with rationality and with a reasoned assessment of what is in America's interest, what is in the world's interest. At the same time, I also don't know that people understood at that point exactly what, how close a correlation there would be between the words of senior Israeli officials and the actions of the IDF. I think there is a misperception in Washington that the IDF is, as it advertises itself, an ethical force and that it is a professional force. And as we have seen over the last 10 months, neither of those, for the most part, is true. So there was also, of course, just this political desire to respond to Israel's needs and whims, regardless of what was being said by its leadership in that moment. So I think it was a combination of all of those factors. I think it's unfortunate that we didn't listen more carefully to what the words were that were actually being said.
Now, let's to your decision to resign. You felt like you couldn't be complicit in just rubber stamping the transfer of arms. At the same time, your voice it seems like it would be very important and unique behind the scenes. Do you feel there are other people in government still who are raising some of the current concerns you're raising, fighting the good fight from the inside? Or do you feel that, many of the other people that you work with are not going to be challenging things or haven't been challenging things from the inside?
So, I mean, just to address the beginning of that, I think if I felt that my voice would have had any, impact within government, I would have stayed to use that voice. It was clear to me after 10 days that there just wasn't going to be that opportunity. And to a great extent, that is reflected in what I've heard from a lot of current civil servants across the US government who have been, as you say, fighting the good fight and raising these issues, raising them in policy chains, raising them through dissent channel cables, which is a mechanism of the State Department, raising them through complaints to the inspectors general at the various organizations, but have been met repeatedly with closed doors and covered ears. That the senior leadership does not want to hear their complaints and does not want to change course. So I think that there are a lot of people who are doing what they can to try and press the system. And to be clear, right, not everyone works on arms transfers. So if you are an official in the US government who is working on humanitarian relief, I think there are some very compelling reasons why you might want to stay inside the US government to continue to push on humanitarian relief issues. Where there is that degree of separation from some of the more immediate arms transfer decisions that are happening. But my sense from people is just an immense amount of yes, good faith efforts, but also frustration that those have not been leading to any significant changes in policy.
Gotcha. Now it's been almost 10 months since you stepped down. We've seen the death toll in Gaza rise. We've seen who knows how many, but at least tens of thousands of Palestinians killed. Several Israeli hostages have been killed as well. And you've got this risk of a regional war. What's your assessment of U.S. policy right now? It is true that early on, President Biden was questioning the Palestinian death toll, saying a ceasefire will never happen. Now it seems like they're saying we want a ceasefire of some sorts. Vice President Harris expressed some sympathetic words towards Palestinian suffering. What's your assessment of where we are now? Do you think that leadership is finally listening to the concerns that you all were expressing 10 months ago, or do you feel that nothing really practically has changed because the guns are still flowing, the bombs are still flowing?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think nothing has really practically changed. The guns are still flowing. The bonds are still flowing. Just last week, the US released $3.5 billion, again, in taxpayer funding for Israel's defense needs. It also approved or sent to Congress a case for another 6,500 air-to-ground precision guidance kits. So the weapons are still flowing. The policies have not fundamentally changed. And I think that this has been doing, you asked what the consequences are. I think this has been doing, obviously, immense harm to the Palestinians. There's no question about that. I also happen to think that it's been doing damage to Israel's own interests and further isolating it in the region. But it's also been doing immense harm to America's interests. And one of the things that has struck me is how willing this administration has been to sacrifice American credibility, to sacrifice American leadership, in order to continue to advance these arms transfers and assistance directly to Israel. It just doesn't make strategic sense to me, let alone moral sense. And I really struggle with that.
So then the question, Ms. Paul, is where do we go from here? There's an attempt to try to push for some sort of ceasefire in Doha or Cairo this week. Do you expect this to be successful? Where do you think what's your assessment of where we go from here? I know you're not an analyst or a prognosticator of the future, but what's your expectation where we go from here? Are we going to be talking about this 6 months from now? Or do you think we might see finally some change as a result of all the horror we've seen and the political pressure we're seeing within the United States and around the world?
So I would love to be proven wrong. I would love for there to be a successful ceasefire deal next week, and the sooner the better, or even this week. I do think, I suspect that we are going to see continuation of where we are now, certainly through the US elections. And I think that that's the case because I think Prime Minister Netanyahu thinks it is in his interest for that to be the case. He knows that college campuses will be returning this fall, that there'll be a upsurge in protests around the country, and I think that he sees that those tensions within the U.S. political system as being in his interest, as he first of all maneuvers to get more space for Israel, and frankly also maneuvers to do what he can to support former President Trump's re-election bid, which is also in his interest. So for those reasons, I suspect that there will not be significant changes. There could be pauses, there could be hostage exchanges, but I think that there will be a continuation basically of the status quo, through at least early November. I also want to caution that as important and vital as an immediate and permanent ceasefire is, we shouldn't for a second think that, okay, well, that's the end of this and now we can all move on, right? That will leave behind in its wake, first of all, an immense humanitarian crisis in Gaza that will take a generation to recover from in the best of circumstances, immense healthcare needs, and of course will also leave, in all likelihood, Israeli soldiers in Gaza, and the potential for further strikes and clashes and what have you. So unfortunately, I don't see, when it comes to Gaza, at least in the short to medium term, a future that looks all that different to what it looks like right now.
So, Mr. Paul, let me ask you this final question. What's your message to those still serving in government, right? You interact with some of them, I'm sure, now, but what message you deliver to them about how to try to effect positive change within? What's your message to them?
Well, so first of all, I think that they are playing a really important role. And I will say that it was my experience, except on this one issue, that, in many cases, you can do more good in one day in government than you can do in a lifetime outside of it. And so, first of all, I would say also to your audience, and particularly to any young people who are watching and thinking, in the wake of all we've seen in the last 10 months, do I actually want to work for the US government? Do I want to serve at the federal level? Please do. Please do. We need, voices of conscience within the system. We need good people within the system, because if they are not, it can get even worse than it is. And I would say the same thing, I think, to those who are in government. That your voices are important, your work is important. I think there are some for whom the appropriate thing to do is to step aside. But there are many, I think, who are working in good faith, and I want them to know that they have certainly the full support of those of us who have left government. They are welcome to reach out to any of us. There are 12 of us who have publicly left at any time, and we are happy to connect them to any resources they may need. But I just thank them for their service in an incredibly difficult circumstance.
Absolutely. Well, Mr. Paul, we thank you for joining us today and for your principled voice on this issue. I mean, it's, you've seen college students risking their educations, their safety to protest. You've seen government officials giving up their careers within government to speak out against what is wrong. And so we thank you for your courage, and we look forward to having you back in the future, hopefully to discuss the end of this horrific violence and the pursuit of a just peace. So thank you so much, Mr. Paul.
Thank you very much indeed for having me.
Thank you. And we thank you all for joining us for today's segment on Muslim Network TV. We hope you found this educational, and we encourage you to learn more about Mr. Paul online, read his writings, and watch some of his other videos, because you can learn so much more about government work, what's happening behind the scenes, and what we can do outside of government to try to encourage our political leaders to do better. Thank you all so much. We'll see you next time, inshallah, God willing. Until then, assalamu alaikum. May peace be upon you.